Okay, so welcome everybody to this guest lecture, which is special today because it's the first, at least on our side, GreenDeal-NET guest lecture. I'm very happy we have Professor Sebastian Oberthur with us today. Let me do this so that people can see you. Sebastian Oberthur is the co-director of the Research Center for Environment, Economy and Energy at the Brussels School of Governance, where he is also Professor of Environment and Sustainable Development. I'll be very brief on his CV because otherwise we'll spend the entire 2 hours discussing his many achievements. He's also Professor of Environmental Policy and Law at the University of Eastern Finland. He has extensive expertise on European and international environmental issues, especially environmental governance, environmental policy and law. Among many other roles, he has served from 2006 to 2013 as a member of the Compliance Committee of the Kyoto Protocol for the UNFCCC. Professor Oberthur received a PhD in political science from the Free University of Berlin, but he also has a strong background in international law. And this makes him an excellent example of the kind of multidisciplinary research we promote and engage into here at the School of International Studies. And so we are particularly happy to have him here with us today, even remotely. Today he's also here as in his capacity as coordinator of the Jean Monnet Research Network GreenDeal-NET, the European Green Deal governing the EU's transition toward climate neutrality and sustainability, which is a research network funded by the European Commission. It is a network of 12 universities across 11 EU countries. The main objective of the network is the dissemination of knowledge about climate change, in particular, the governance of the ambitious European plan toward climate neutrality. So the School of International Studies is, of course, a very proud member of the consortium, and we are very grateful to Sebastian and to the rest of the team for including us into this consortium. Today's talk is titled Delivering on the European Green Deal, Governing the Climate Transition Beyond Emission Reductions, and will be based on a recent policy paper that has been written by Sebastian and a group of co-authors, which is also freely available on the project website, and I encourage all of you to read it. So Sebastian, you have about 45 minutes for your talk, and then we'll open up the floor for question and discussion. This time I promise, at least to the audience here, that we will be starting from students in getting the questions, unlike what I did last week, and so I received many complaints about this. Thank you very much for being with us, Sebastian. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Perhaps also to say that obviously the website of GreenDeal-NET is greendealnet.eu. So if you're looking for that report and for further information on the network, you'll find it there. I should perhaps also say that we have this online, so several people are following via Zoom. We have a crowd here in Brussels, and we have you in Trento, and I don't know how it works in Maastricht, but anyway, we'll have to coordinate the questions a little bit, but I'm sure we'll be able to do that. Delivering on the European Green Deal, governing the climate transition beyond emission reductions. I don't know what you think when you look at the title, but you may think, oh, he's perhaps going to talk about adaptation policy, because that's not about emission reductions. That's not it, I can already tell you. It is about a focus mainly on mitigation, but on those matters that actually do not immediately regulate, govern emission reductions. So it is about how we take decisions in climate policy and law, how we implement them, the procedural side, so to speak. I should perhaps go to the next slide if that's possible. Anyway, then we do it like this, also not possible. Yes. And I will talk a little bit about the importance of the procedural or constitutional framework for climate governance, which is really what I will be focusing on. And I haven't found the ideal word yet, but I'll primarily refer to constitutional climate governance. Just to signal that this is something about the basics, how we take decisions, how we implement them in climate policy. And hopefully by the end of the lecture, you will be able to give advice to me what it should be called. So first, something about the importance of that constitutional framework for climate governance, then the key elements of this constitutional climate governance framework or frameworks. And then we'll move more towards what already exists in the EU and what perhaps might be missing in that field, assessment of the EU's climate governance framework, achievements, gaps, options to close the gaps. And then conclude with a number of thoughts about how and whether we are moving towards a constitutionalizing EU climate governance. So the importance of procedural constitutional framework for climate governance. For that, I would like to start with the features of the climate challenge. The climate challenge has been described as a super wicked problem. And that, first of all, sounds like, okay, it's complicated. Yes, it's complicated. But perhaps we can dig a layer deeper and more in detail identify what is complicated, etc., and what the features of the problem are. First of all, urgency, and that is obviously transported through science, through scientific assessments of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. How urgent the problem is, we know it's pretty urgent to address it because climate change is already underway and the impacts are severe. Second is the long-term nature of the challenge and also the political approach that we need to address the challenge. The impacts develop over decades, but also the response of societies and of policymaking cannot be from one day to the other. We need a long-term policymaking where we have a long-term pathway towards climate neutrality and climate stabilization. Third is it's cross-sectoral and whole of society and whole of economy. It's not that we can take action just in one area, etc. It needs to be in many areas. The areas are interconnected, transport, buildings, electricity production, etc., etc. But also other areas that one may not think of, like investments. All of that needs to be governed, and it's a task for the whole of the society and the economy. Fourth is it's a dynamic problem and a complex problem. So there are all these interconnections. On the science side of things, that ecosystems are interconnected and complexly connected, but also in the response that we are devising, in the laws and the policies, there are lots of interconnections that need to be considered, of social interconnections, of how people react, etc. And it's dynamic, it's changing. The climate is changing, but also our societies are constantly changing, and the technologies that we have available are changing, etc. So it's a dynamic setting. That dynamism may be partially due to things that are inherent to climate change, but it obviously also comes because our world is getting more turbulent, so it seems, right? And I'll come back to that later, how things have actually changed just when you think about the last 5 years. And finally, it's contested. It's a contested problem. If we look at it politically and socially, it's not something where we can easily say, oh, now we have the solution, now we go forward. It's contested in every step there are distributional consequences of the measures that we're taking. Those will necessarily be contested, but there's also a lot of change that needs to come if we want to stabilize the climate, and change is always contested. There will always be people who ask, why do we need to change? Because we like status quo. There's usually not a whole bunch running around saying, we want change, finally change. So these are the main features. Perhaps there are a few additional features one could think of the climate challenge as a super wicked problem. Still doesn't work, okay. So why am I telling you that? Because the solution that we think about has to fit the problem, right? Climate governance needs to be fit for purpose, matching the problem and the problem structure. So our political response, if it wants to be effective, needs to take into account these features of the problem. Problem and solution, that's obviously a simplified illustration of how that fits. If that is the case, then we need to think about what it is that an effective climate governance response would entail. And this is now going beyond this constitutional governance framework that I mentioned. This is more comprehensive, but should allow us to then see where the constitutional bit is located. First of all, we obviously, in response to the urgency, the ambition needs to be high enough so that the problem actually gets addressed. And we all know roughly what the ambition needs to be. We just had the most recent IPCC report. So we need to reduce emissions by like half by 2030, and then as soon as possible thereafter get to net zero emissions and to negative emissions. That's on a global scale. For Europe, that would obviously be more ambitious. We also know that we need policies and policy mixes that match the socio-economic and political complexities, the barriers and drivers that exist. And that means in most areas that need to be regulated, that we need policy mixes, not the one policy that brings us the solution. And we've had lots of debates over the past weeks in the European policy making about certain policies that need to be there or could be replaced, like CO2 in cars. We have an ongoing debate on buildings, and there's a lot of discussion usually over whether it should be the one instrument or the other. But more probably, it should probably be how these instruments can work together. That's what a lot of the research says. But that will not be the subject of today's lecture, really. Then we have climate policy integration. So we need climate policies all over the place. That's the result of the cross-sectoral, cross-cutting nature of the challenge, that we need to regulate and govern various sectors, including sectors and policy areas that are not directly climate related, foreign policy, investments, etc. Implementation and enforcement, that's perhaps not really that much related to the particular features of the climate challenge, because whatever policy area we have, if we have policies, we want them to be actually being implemented and followed and leading to behavioral change. And then the last bit, we need a just and inclusive procedural constitutional governance framework matching the long-term nature, because we need policy frameworks that can develop policies over a long time. We will need to adapt our policies over time. Also take into account the dynamism and complexity. The dynamism already will lead to the fact that we will need to adapt policies over time. It needs to be whole of society, and it needs to address the contentiousness. So that's what we need to think about in this last bit. So beyond, what of this is beyond emission reductions? And what of this will then now further feature in the other parts of the lecture? Ambition, we always discuss all the time, should the EU do minus 55% climate neutrality by when, etc. That's not it. That's emission reductions. Policies, a large part of that is also policy mixes. How do we get to the emission reductions? Where it goes beyond that is climate policy integration, at least the part where it goes beyond the emission sectors, right? How do we make sure that overall everything adds up? We change also in policy areas like investments, etc. How do we make sure that there's consistency across the different policies? That's beyond emission reductions. Implementation and enforcement, well, okay, it's partially about emission reductions, but it's also about how we actually make sure that the policies are implemented and followed. That's a little bit beyond emission reduction. And the last bit, the just and inclusive procedural constitutional governance framework that I just mentioned. How do we take decisions? What are the inputs, etc. That is definitely beyond emissions reductions. And I will actually, for the remainder of the lecture, refer to this last phrase, constitutional governance framework, as this whole area down here, everything that's beyond emissions reductions. So that's just to locate what we are talking about, right? So if we now think about constitutional climate governance frameworks, what are the elements beyond what we just saw? How can we structure the field? And this is the proposal. It's not said that this is the final word on this. I think we are also, in terms of research, perhaps not at the end yet of how we conceptualize that whole area, but that's one attempt. The first area would be in all of this, and that is a little bit inspired also by what we have at the EU level, as you will see then. Medium and long-term planning, including targets. So we need to have something in place where we plan for the long term, if this is a long-term target, and we need long-term policies, also policy development. Medium and long-term planning, that may include target setting, because planning is inspired by targets and informed by targets, right? Otherwise, you don't necessarily know where you're planning towards. So it includes targets. The second, more referring to this implementation and enforcement, is reporting, review, and effective implementation. What are the mechanisms there that we have to actually get the right data about implementation, review them also, and if things go wrong, to then also respond to it. The third one is scientific expertise. Obviously, climate, like other environmental problems, is one where we have an environment, where we actually also have technologies, etc., and we should be informed by the knowledge about that. We should preferably be also be informed, perhaps, by knowledge about policies and how they work. Because in the end, things will only work if we take that knowledge into account. So scientific expertise also as one area. Then climate policy integration again, it needs to add up, it needs to be consistent. We need to make sure that other policy areas don't interfere with their policies and hinder climate protection, etc. And finally, the rule of law and climate democracy. How do we make sure that there's societal ownership in our societies, that they support the climate transition? And obviously, you can make links of each of this to the problem features that we had heard. This is about, obviously, contentiousness also, responding to that, making sure there's support in society for the climate transition. Climate policy integration is this cross-cutting nature again, right? Scientific expertise responds also to the urgency, reporting, review, and effective implementation to the implementation point. Medium and long-term planning primarily to the long-term nature of the problem. So these are elements of constitutional climate governance frameworks. And what's then next is first of all showing you the front page of the study that was mentioned, and that is available at the GreenDeal-NET website. And what I have to add from here on very much draws on that study. So the assessment of the EU's climate governance framework, where are we with respect to these matters, long-term planning, etc. Just take a zip. Good. So where do we find the EU's climate governance framework? There are two prime instruments that one may wish to look at. That is the 2018 so-called governance regulation, regulation on the governance of the Energy Union Climate Action is the full name. That has a lot of these rules and procedures in there. And then we have what's called the European Climate Law, or the regulation establishing the framework for achieving climate neutrality, adopted in 2021. These are perhaps the central instruments, but there are other instruments that are relevant, which are indicated up here, other instruments and arrangements in individual pieces of legislation. We may think of when it comes to public participation and access to justice, the Aarhus regulation, but also other individual pieces of climate legislation that are relevant and one can look at. But perhaps take-home message, governance regulation and European climate law are the major pieces in which this is anchored. So what do we have in terms of medium and long-term planning? That's coming out of the governance regulation. We do have national energy and climate plans and long-term strategies that member states have to elaborate and have to submit. Actually, the national energy and climate plans, they have to prepare every 5 years, update or prepare a new one. The long-term strategies in principle every 10 years, but they can also update them every 5 years. We are currently just at the point where national energy, climate, and NECPs, as they're called, were elaborated in 2018-19. And now by the middle of this year, member states have to submit updates of these NECPs. And they can then afterwards, in the year thereafter, also prepare updates of the long-term strategies that they have prepared. And these are certainly proven to be useful. It's a useful exercise to think about what should be done over the next 10 years, which is the time frame for the NECPs, and how that fits into a longer term trajectory, namely 30 years that should be covered in the long-term strategies. And having said that, that's a good innovation to have introduced those instruments. On the other side, there's room for improvement. If you look at the first reports, there was quite a variation across the member states regarding the quality and the depth of these plans and also the long-term strategies. Nowadays, after the energy crisis and the energy security crisis that we have had over the past 2 years or so, one has to say, well, that perhaps the energy security dimension could have been better integrated. It is part of the NECPs. They are not just climate plans, they are energy and climate plans. But the integration of the energy security dimension could have been better. And also how the long-term strategies and the NECPs are integrated could have been slightly better, especially in how member states that did that then also. When you think about actually both processes could easily be integrated at member state level. When you think about that, there are also requirements, as we'll get to later on, for public consultations, etc. You may actually want to combine and relate the two processes more closely to each other than they were. One particular point, I said before, it's good to have targets for planning, right? Then you know what you're planning towards. But member states have no requirements to actually have national climate neutrality targets. We do have the European climate neutrality target that's well known. By 2050, Europe, the EU, should be climate neutral. So net zero emissions by 2050. But what does that mean for individual member states? That's not exactly clear unless the member states establish targets that add up to the climate neutrality target at the European level. And there's no requirement to do that. Several member states, and this is a graph that was prepared like a year ago, but I don't think there have been too many updates in the meantime. There are some member states in darker green which actually have climate neutrality targets earlier than 2050. There are some that have climate neutrality targets for 2050. There are some who have climate neutrality targets, but they are not a law, they're just policy targets. And there are some that don't have any climate neutrality targets at all. So they may not exactly know what they're planning towards then. It might be useful to have them in the future. So what are the options to perhaps improve the situation, as is outlined in more detail in the study? There could be enhanced guidance in and under the governance regulation, obviously. There could be a requirement for national climate neutrality targets, could take different forms. Either you could tell member states, you all please establish a climate neutrality target that shouldn't be later than 2050. Or you tell them it is actually 2050 for you. Or you tell them, you know, if it's not 2050, you need to explain to us how it could be compatible with the European target, which is not excluded if other member states have negative emissions at that point in time. The NECP and LTS processes could be further aligned. One of the issues is, for example, that, as I mentioned before, the long-term strategies, you actually are only bound to actually have new ones every 10 years. You are not bound to have an update after 5 years. But now imagine, well, the due date for the long-term strategies before was 2020. Just consider how the world has changed since. The COVID crisis, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and you don't take that into account in your long-term thinking? Somewhat strange. So it would make sense to now provide updates. And obviously member states are free to do that, but perhaps it's also good to be nudged to do that regularly. So perhaps actually these LTSs, these long-term strategies, should be updated every 5 years. But then there's also issues about the review and the revision. So drafts of these plans usually get reviewed by the Commission. Afterwards, they're revised by the member states and finalized. And you could enhance the review procedures. You could give more powers to the Commission. You could say if the plans are not up to standards, they could get rejected. Or there could be cross-compliance mechanisms. So that usually refers to mechanisms where if things are not well, you get kind of a penalty somewhere else. And that in the EU usually means some pot of funding, where you say, okay, your plan is not up to standards, you cannot access this fund for the time being, until it is up to standards. And also the analyses that are available about these plans show that the requirements to actually have public consultations, to have public participation, are also frequently not up to standards. So perhaps these requirements could also be spelled out further to support that there is more public participation and consultation in the preparation of these plans and strategies. Because obviously these plans and strategies are not a matter just of the government writing something down. They need to be owned by society if you want to follow them and implement them. And then there's the point also that actually the regulation foresaw that the EU itself prepare one long-term strategy, which it did in 2018. It doesn't talk about when that should be updated. I would actually expect that it gets updated now as the Commission prepares for the next phase of determining targets for 2035 and 2040. that then also the EU long-term strategy gets updated. But as well, one may write in there that if it makes sense for the member states to update the long-term strategies, the EU long-term strategy should also be updated regularly. Again, with everything that has happened since 2018, just seems obvious that it makes sense to take stock. Good. Next area is progress reporting, review, implementation. Progress reporting is well established. It is in the governance regulation, but it was before in what was called the monitoring mechanism. So member states have to report every year on emissions, and every 2 years they have to prepare so-called biannual reports, progress reports, where they also deal with what policies they're implementing, have implemented, are planning to implement, etc. One lesson from all this over the past 20, 30 years of reporting is you need to go after this each and every time and need to pay continuous attention. It's not that once the reporting system is in place, it functions. It just needs constant attention, otherwise you're moving backwards. So it needs follow-up and further development. When we come to actually then ensuring implementation, we have in the EU the normal infringement procedure under the treaties, which can enhance implementation. All the literature shows that, but that gives a lot of discretion to the Commission to actually decide whether or not to start these proceedings. And the procedure is usually quite lengthy until it gets to the last stage of going to the European Court. Some, but not all, key instruments have their own implementation support mechanisms. The CO2 in cars regulation foresees penalties for car manufacturers that are not meeting the standards under the European Emissions Trading Directive. If you overshoot, you have a penalty as well that applies, etc. So there are these things, and some targeted funding mechanisms also exist to support implementation, but not all of them, right? And the governance regulation itself has a very specific review and recommendation system, including for energy efficiency and renewable energy targets, with significant limitations. So, well, the limitation is that it's review and recommendations, but there is not much more than recommendations if it doesn't work, right? So it's relatively soft. It has been coined also harder soft governance because, well, at least it nudges member states without real penalties at the end. So what are the options to further develop reporting? Coverage of all key areas. In the past, in particular, the electricity and the transport sector have been very much in focus in the reporting. Could be wider and ensure high quality. Then this system of review and recommendations could be strengthened, right? In the governance regulation, more powers given to the Commission. Also, what's sometimes a limit is the Commission capacity for actually starting up infringement proceedings and following through. An element in strengthening all this could again be cross-compliance mechanisms where funding is kind of blocked if progress is not made. But also there's an element in all this of where sometimes technical assistance is needed. You need, as a member state, quite a bit of capacity to collect all these data. So technical assistance can also be strengthened. Let's move on. Lots of areas. Scientific expertise. We talked about that. The European Climate Law introduces something new, namely the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, which gives quite a new potential to actually provide an input from science into European policymaking. It also has a few limitations. The mandate is quite vague and not very specific on what the board should do. The link to policymaking is perhaps not very clear. I'll say something more about that in a minute, then hopefully gets clearer. And several, but not all member states have established national advisory bodies. And their design and capacities vary significantly. So how well they work then accordingly also varies quite a bit. So what would be suggestions to improve that? We could further specify the mandate of the European Scientific Advisory Board. For example, one could specify there are 5 yearly Commission assessments of progress. Perhaps the board could be told to always provide input to that. There's the EU long-term strategy that hopefully in the future will occur regularly. Perhaps the advisory board could provide input to that. So a little bit more specificity when it comes to the role of the advisory board. And the link to policymaking could be strengthened. What about actually telling the European institutions to whom the board provides its advice that they should consider that advice? And perhaps tell the public, you know, what they have done with that advice when they then take decisions. Which is not, I mean, it's for the most part not provided for. And then we can think about how to further spread and provide for an appropriate design of national advisory bodies. Could, for example, be guidelines on how these bodies should best be set up. And there could also be a requirement, we could move towards a requirement to actually set them up where they don't exist yet. Climate policy integration. Also great progress over the past years under the European Green Deal. We have, and the European Green Deal kind of established that the so-called do no significant harm principle. So no policies of the EU should actually harm the climate and sustainability agendas. And the Commission has already promised that it will check that for any forthcoming proposals. But actually, the European climate law also then gives the obligation to the Commission for each of its legislative proposals to check that it's consistent with the climate neutrality objective, right? Still, climate policy integration, although it has made progress, remains incomplete and insufficient. Think of the agricultural policy of the EU, where there's very little environment and climate in there. It's an uphill struggle to get it in there. So there's more to be done. And the do no significant harm principle remains to be further anchored and further extended, actually, to also go the other step, that not only prevent harm, but also maximize synergy where synergy is to be reaped. And that's a thought that perhaps also still needs to trickle down. And then there's room for the integration of multiple national plans that countries have to prepare, including for economics and climate. As I said already, the NECPs, the National Energy Climate Plans, and the long-term strategies can be better integrated, but also beyond that, you have economic plans of member states, etc. So how do we do this? We could legally codify this do no significant harm principle. We could provide specific focus of the consistency assessments that the European climate law mandates, that those focus on cross-sector policies. We enhance coherence across national plans, also get more expertise on do no significant harm in your advisory committees, and the systematic monitoring of member states' green transition progress, including through the more economics policy-oriented European semester. So you see already, whoa, it's a lot. It's lots of reforms that we can think of and that perhaps we should think of, with lots of detailed proposals that you find then also in the study. So let's move on to the last bit, rule of law and climate democracy. Also there we see lots of progress over the past years. I mentioned the Aarhus regulation, which has enhanced access to justice in environmental and climate matters at the EU level. What we also see is uneven and incomplete access to justice among EU member states. And there's still issues about standing when you want to go to the European courts in matters of justice in environmental matters. Then also, when we think more broadly, there is a lot going on in the EU, in the member states, about new mechanisms of deliberative and participatory democracy. There's climate assemblies that are popping up everywhere. There are other mechanisms of consultation. I mentioned already that the governance regulation provides for public consultations when member states elaborate NECPs, long-term strategies, should in principle happen. We also have the European Climate Pact that is kind of more connecting European policymaking to the grassroots and really trying to make the link there. But there's also much more room for systematic and targeted advance of participatory and deliberative climate democracy, as one may call it. A lot has been experimented with and is under development, but it's not yet in a brought into a coherent whole. Still, we could strengthen access to justice obligations on EU member states, because as I said, at the moment, it varies quite a bit across the member states how that's done. We could strengthen and concretize really the requirements for public participation at EU and member state level. A more systematic and focused use of deliberative and consultation mechanisms. We have public consultations, but perhaps we need to have more detail on how they should be done. There is a lot of what perhaps should happen more of also sectoral consultations, where we advise member states and also the European level that we need to discuss with sectors that are concerned beforehand about measures. There could be broader consultation structure at the EU level, where stakeholders regularly get together and get consulted on EU climate policy. Stakeholder representation in EU committees, the various committees that exist could be looked at, and the European Climate Pact could be reviewed and further developed. And all that would be to really bring to life this kind of public participation, and that there is a discussion process within member states and at the EU level, but I think both of these levels are very important to get societal ownership and get the buy-in of everybody to do this. So it's a broad agenda of many, many items that still can be improved. Moving to the conclusion. So, as I said at the beginning, this is beyond emissions reductions. This is about structures. This is about how do we structure public discussion in the member states, public consultation, access to courts, about how do we plan, etc. How do we take decisions? How should science inform this decision making, right? So it's and it's towards constitutionalizing climate governance for the required societal mobilization and transition. And we have all these elements, right? Planning, review, and reporting and implementation, science, scientific advice, climate policy integration, and the rule of law and climate democracy. And the task is to connect them all, right? They are not independent of each other. They relate to each other. Climate policy integration relates to all the other elements, how we report and do implementation. The plans need to incorporate climate policy integration, etc. And we do not only need to connect them, we also need to shape this all into a coherent whole, into one program, where all the many things that I said, and we could do this and could do this and could do this, if we look at it at the end, we say, yes, this is fit for purpose. This will provide for societal ownership, support that, and make sure that we move into the right direction. And in doing so, we need to be aware of the dynamism and the complexity of the issue. So even once we have that, we will have to review it and further develop it regularly, because society also moves on. So where are we? Usually the question afterwards, and perhaps somebody wants to pose the question, is the glass now half full or is it half empty? Because you said we have made progress here, we could do more there. I think at the stage where we are with the climate crisis, this question is irrelevant. It's about, we need to fill the empty half of the glass. Whether it's empty half or half full, just needs to get full, right? So whatever, you tell me whether it's half full or half empty, I don't care. I want to have it full. And why is that? Because it's urgent. It's just urgent, and we need to look ways to convey that message in a clear way. I don't know whether this is clear, but this is at least from science. We need to change course. Emissions have increased for the past 200 years. Now we need them to be reduced drastically within a very short time frame, and to get to zero somewhere early in the second half of this century. If not earlier, if we don't change course quickly, then it will need to be even earlier. This is from the latest IPCC report. It nicely perhaps also shows that it's urgent. Here are the different emission scenarios, low, very low. We are currently not on a low, very low trajectory. If we are if we are lucky, we are on an intermediate trajectory, but could also be high. And down here you have the different generations. So I don't know when all of you were born, but if you were born in 1950, then you're 70 years old now, a bit older. We will see how much of the impacts you still see. Born in 1980, well, you will see impacts that are very much more severe than they are at present. And if we talk about the children born in the 2020, then within their lifetimes, they're likely on the current trajectory to see really high impacts and increase of temperatures of 3 degrees or more. So there is no time to lose. So then the next question perhaps is, do we have time to constitutionalize EU climate governance? Because changing the structures usually doesn't happen from one day to the other. But what's the alternative? Moving to authoritarianism? It's not proven that that helps for the climate, nor is it perhaps something that we want. Is it societal conflict and resistance? We can't afford that. Perhaps we don't want it, but it's also not helpful for the climate transition if we have quarrels all the time and huge divides within society, how to go there. So they're likely worse. So we not just need to push ahead anyway. We need to speed up as much as possible. And sure, that will not be overnight, but we have upcoming reviews and revisions of the European climate law and the governance regulation as a prime opportunity. The governance regulation and the European climate law both foresee that they will be reviewed in the first half of 2024, and there may be legislative proposals on how to improve them at the same time or thereafter, and in the case of the European climate law, actually potentially even earlier. And we sometimes don't need to wait for legislative change to improve things. We can already improve consultation mechanisms at national level without waiting for putting something in the European climate law or the governance regulation that helps us. Frequently, what's in the legislation actually captures progress that has been made on the ground. So let's make that progress already. I would like to finish with a piece of climate art that we found. Just in case that wasn't clear.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. It was very fascinating and very comprehensive as well.